your Unit 4 review video on political ideologies and political beliefs. It's going to be a rather short review video because Unit 4 is, we covered it within a week. It's probably one of the easiest units because a lot of the material is so intuitive. So without further ado, let's get into it. So the first thing that we really talked about is the values that kind of shape our political beliefs. And we came to the conclusion that people that emphasize different values might find different types of political narratives or political parties more appealing than people that emphasize other types of values. So here's a kind of list of some of the values that we kind of identified. We saw some political rhetoric that kind of emphasized one value over the other, and I asked you to kind of identify those values within political speakers and the orientation, liberal or conservative, of that speaker. So we talked about individualism, kind of an idea advocating liberty, rights, or independent action of the individual. And we put individualism in contrast with kind of collectivism. We said that in the United States, individualism is a much more prominent feature than collectivism is in comparison to other societies. We talked about more collectivist ideologies, kind of like socialism, or collectivist, I guess, kind of arguments of we're all in this together, kind of de-emphasizing the individual. Oftentimes, but not all the times, politicians really kind of emphasize individuality, put a lot of importance on a person's individual rights and freedoms and liberties. But there can be also rhetoric that isn't necessarily individualistic, but kind of is closer to collectivistic, that does make appearances in US political speech, and of course has a concert or a constituency that certainly tries to emphasize those types of values. Talked about equality of opportunity. We did a whole prompt on equality of opportunity, the civil rights prompt. We're going to further complicate this narrative because a lot of us picked the courts as the main mechanisms that has advanced equality of opportunity in the United States, and that there's some people that would find that argument convincing if we're just talking about the Warren Court and all the other courts. They would be a little bit more suspicious of their efforts in advancing equality of opportunity, but that's another point that we'll get to when we start reviewing for the semester exam. But that's an interesting preview to come. We talked about equality of opportunity, which kind of refers to the fairness of processes through which individuals with different backgrounds or different social groups reach particular outcomes. The emphasis on eliminating barriers or inhibitions, not looking for an equality of outcome. I don't think that type of value is, popular or is present in American culture. But equality of opportunity is certainly used and deployed by a lot of politicians. We talked about free enterprise, this idea of an economic system in which private business operates in competition and are largely free of state control. There are societies outside the United States where there is a lot more state intervention in the economy. The United States likes to, at least in political rhetoric, there's this kind of emphasis on free enterprise, free markets, especially coming from the political right. Rule of law. The rule of law is kind of a set of principles or ideals for ensuring an orderly and just society. It's this idea that no one is above the law, that the law should treat everyone fairly, everyone should be held to the same standards before the law, Yeah, that is kind of a value that has been deployed rhetorically by politicians across both sides of the aisle. Limited government, this idea that government has limitations on its power, its value. What those limitations are defined and redefined by, again, people across the political spectrum, all that good stuff. This is an important concept, political socialization. We talked about this process by which we acquire political beliefs. The most important factor in political socialization is our parents. They define, for a lot of us, our political beliefs. Maybe if we go on to study political science or economics or political philosophy, I don't know. Then that would probably change for the mass majority of us who are only going to take like maybe one more government class or two more government classes in college. Our parents have had such a heavy sway on defining our political values and our beliefs. But other things as well influence our parents and also influence us, like the media that we consume, whether we're consuming far-right media or far-left media, that has an impact. I would speculate that oftentimes we choose our media now, and we'll talk about the changing media dynamics in the United States in Unit 5, but oftentimes we choose our media to validate our political values and beliefs, not to really get informed. Social environments, civic and religious institutions, your teachers can help socialize you, give you, the types of educational environments you're raised in. Those are all, a lot of us like to think of us as ourselves as free thinkers, but the reality is that our political beliefs are very much, imposed upon us at a very young and formative age. They're reinforced in the types of media and religious institutions that define our lives and in part have defined the values of our parents, but aren't necessarily stuff that we get to choose again. So just being aware of political socialization, I think, is really important because it allows us to kind of think reflectively and think critically about our values and beliefs. And it's a little bit hard to question our parents, but I'm sure for those of you that go away from college, you might come up with different political values and beliefs, or you may not. Or not just college, but like become untethered from the household, right? We also talked about this idea of U.S. political culture being a sort of export. U.S. politics is exported. We talked about at the beginning, like this idea of a constitution. In AP World History, you should have talked about like the Age of Revolutions and how inspirational the United States Revolution was, and the kind of ideals that become appropriated by other societies and the efforts to make a written constitution and the works as kind of being an early indicator of the kind of exporting of American politics. But American politics is exported now. I think I cited a couple of articles, but I'll include it in the description of this video, about kind of like the rise of Donald Trump's catchphrase, fake news, being used by strongmen across the world, especially in developing countries, to deride press stories, negative press stories. The rise of, let me think of other elements. It's the only, there's all kinds of ways in which American politics gets exported, especially considering we have such an important role in the world's economy and governing system. We also talked about the influence of political events on ideology. I asked you to reflect on what was a major political event that has happened in your life. For your teachers and I, it was probably 9/11 and the wars. I remember distinctly the Iraq War not going so well and the kind of groundswell and anti-elite or at the time, I guess, anti-George Bush politics that the conduct of the wars kind of instilled. We talked about the Vietnam War being a very huge issue. A lot of you cited the George Floyd death as being kind of like a memorable and searing event that has shaped your political attitudes and beliefs in some form, or at least shaped what your awareness of different sorts of issues. Before, I would imagine like the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Malcolm X were like formative political events in other people's lives. We talked about changes in ideology. We talked about generational and life cycle changes. So the idea of generational changes is this, that there may be different values that different generations have. We all kind of intuitively know this. Maybe the older generations are seen as a bit more conservative than the younger generations, but of course that doesn't obviously have to maintain true. Life cycle effects is this idea that maybe people's political voting behavior changes as their lives progress. So maybe right out of college, they're concerned about student debt and they're going to vote for candidates that are going to alleviate student debt. But maybe when they're 30, they're more concerned about getting a house and more concerned about interest rates and mortgage payments. So they might be, looking for candidates that are more favorable to those types of policies. Cool. Then we talked about American political ideologies and beliefs. We talked and we said that conservatism and liberalism have a complicated history and etymology, meaning the history of the word. So I've included 2 links to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which really should become your friend for your philosophy class that you take in college. Stanford's Encyclopedia of Philosophy is really, really helpful, trust me. But for our purposes, we're going to define these terms as such. And so really the conservative and liberal, or before I define these terms, I want to also just say, I don't think every person that self-identifies as a conservative or self-identifies as a liberal is probably aware about kind of like the every aspect of the ideology as I'm going to define it. There's a lot of different people that are motivated by different sorts of things. And yeah, but at the core, these ideologies in the United States, people that identify as conservative really kind of emphasize small government. There's this core disagreement about the size of government in society and its importance for rectifying social problems in society. So conservatives generally think that small government is preferable. They kind of have a hostility to the unions and the quote unquote welfare state or like social programs, against kind of progressive taxes and regulation. This is kind of out of a slide, I should say, from a lecture on Reagan and Thatcher and how they kind of redefine conservatism in the 80s, Reagan being the American president, and Margaret Thatcher being the British Prime Minister. So if you watch The Crown season 4, I've only seen season 4 of The Crown. It's interesting, probably not very realistic. But there's this kind of emphasis on the free market as being better for the economy, as a government that doesn't interfere in the economy, which kind of gets at economic ideologies as well, which we'll talk about later in this video. But generally wanting a smaller government. Social conservatives there's this kind of joke in college, well, at least at my college, there was this sort of joke because there was a lot of kids that came from very rich boarding schools that were fiscal conservatives but weren't social conservatives because it was seen as kind of not being, I guess, hip to be socially conservative, which I'm not offering the judgment. I'm just expressing the dynamics at my alma mater. And so there's a sort of joke about those types of people. But there are people that identify as fiscal conservatives that probably really do buy into like this free market ideology, free market or emphasis on a smaller government, emphasis on states' rights, but don't really buy into a lot of like the social conservatives' views towards immigration or same-sex marriage or abortion or racism's role in keeping people down. I also didn't really offer a judgment on this because I think conservatism is something that constantly changes. And I think really after the 2012 loss of Mitt Romney to Barack Obama, there was an autopsy that Republicans did, and they definitely wanted to become more appealing and a bit more tolerant of immigrants, of same-sex marriage, kind of those sorts of issues, and move kind of towards the center on those issues, or towards the left on those issues a bit, to capture some more voters. But I think Trump has obviously taken the Republican Party a bit further to the right on those issues. What's interesting too is like Trump kind of took them to the right on like, immigration issues, like more anti-immigrant rhetoric, of course. But on same-sex marriage, there was a lot of thinking that he would be a little bit softer on same-sex marriage. But I think, that he has kind of appointed justices that are not as friendly, or judges that are not as friendly. His policies too have not exactly been as left-leaning on issues regarding the LGBTQ community as people thought. Not on same-sex marriage. Sorry, I'm a little tired, but like with respect to the LGBTQ community. But yeah, we took this Pew Research Center poll that kind of really was trying to gauge people's views on a variety of different social factors that go into people's acceptance of a political ideology and voting for a particular political party. Liberals tend to embrace more social programs. I think that the government is important for economic growth, which gets at economic ideologies and Keynesian economic ideology, that the government should also have a role in rectifying some social problems, that the government can do a lot of good. Ronald Reagan's famous phrase, in contrast, so Ronald Reagan, the conservatives' famous phrase was that government is the problem. Liberals would say that government can fix the problems, so to speak. Socially liberal, again, views on immigration, probably more tolerant, same-sex marriage, abortion, racism's role in keeping people down. I think we all kind of know the intuitive divides between these ideologies that I'm suggesting but I also don't want to make like a hard line. This is the difference. You must accept it if you consider yourself a conservative or a liberal, because some people may be conservative on like fiscal issues, but liberal on social issues, or some people may be liberal on social issues, but conservative on, or I'm sorry, liberal on social issues, but or liberal on fiscal issues, but then conservatives on social issues. So yeah. So again, a note on ideologies in America. We said ideologies constantly change. Characterizing ideologies is hard. Some people buy into certain aspects of ideology, reject others. Ideologies nonetheless push us to action in America today. Ideology is closely correlated with political party. It was not always this way. Republicans are seen as conservatives, Democrats are seen as liberals, and political typologies lie on a spectrum. I also forgot to explain, obviously, conservatives pro-life, liberals pro-choice with respect to abortion. That has kind of been like a very important issue for a lot of people. We'll talk about single issue voting in Unit 5. Maybe a single issue voter really cares about abortion and doesn't really subscribe to most of this other stuff, but really thinks abortion is important, and so they vote for Republicans anyways. So that kind of gets at this idea that some people may subscribe to certain aspects of a political ideology, not necessarily all of the aspects of a political ideology, and that defining these ideologies is inherently problematic endeavor. Okay, this is like a stupid chart from the Princeton Review. You can review it. I guess these are more like ideas about what a Democrat is and ideas about what a Republican is. And sometimes I think it correlates well. Democrats tend to be less disposed to spend on defense, Republicans more disposed to spend on defense. Democrats are seen as less disposed to use vouchers or other public funds to enable certain students to private/charter schools. Republicans more disposed to use vouchers for private or charter schools and give governmental aids to parochial schools. So that's their kind of policies on education. Republicans less disposed to spend money on social welfare programs. Democrats more disposed to spend money on social welfare programs. More disposed to use money for public education goes to Democrats. Less disposed to use government money for public education, Republicans. More disposed to grant tax relief to targeted programs such as lower and middle classes goes to Democrats. More disposed to grant tax relief to everyone, including the wealthy and corporations, Republicans. Against private ownership of assault weapons and supportive of broad regulation on the ownership of firearms, Democrats. Less disposed to regulate firearms. Yes. Now we're going to get at economic ideologies. So we talked about like Keynesian thinking, and we also talked about kind of like I guess the intellectual origins of like supply side thinking and laissez-faire ideology. That's what I meant to say. So in mixed economies, so first, before we get into like ideologies, we want to talk about like economic systems. So mixed economies are capitalist free market systems in which both government and private industry play a role. The United States is a mixed economy. It's not this rugged capitalism that I think a lot of people kind of caricature it as. It has a lot of state intervention in the economy. And the sorts of ideologies that we're going to focus on and that we're going to kind of attach with a political party, probably inappropriately, as we've read that foreign policy article on economic political ideologies and economists. But there's laissez-faire ideology, which is this belief that government should never become involved in economic issues. And then the Keynesian approach holds that government can smooth out economic downturns by spending more money. So we're going to kind of inappropriately label Republicans and conservatives as adopting a kind of laissez-faire approach. And we'll see that this becomes complicated when we read the foreign policy article, where it really kind of talks about deficit spending and the kind of spending that President Trump and certainly other previous Republican presidents or Republican administrations have undertaken. So it kind of complicates this picture that Republicans are always going to advocate for a more less government regulation in the economy, and that Democrats are always going to advocate for spending exorbitant sums, especially in economic downturns, to kind of fix the economy. Yeah, we'll get at this in a bit. First, we want to know how economic policy is made. So there are two types of policy. There's fiscal policy, which is described as like government action that is either coming from Congress or the president, cutting or raising taxes, spending money on social programs, spending money on infrastructure. Those are kind of fiscal policy. And then there's the monetary policy, which we'll talk about or we won't talk about it because we're taking microeconomics next semester, but I think I'm going to be teaching AP macroeconomics to a select group of students as well. So if you're in that macroeconomics class, we'll talk about it then. But monetary policy, which is essentially the Federal Reserve Board right here, we're not going to explain the mechanisms how unless you take the AP macroeconomics, controls interest rates, can raise or lower interest rates, and has a big effect on the economy. Right here you can see kind of Keynesian belief. Keynesians believe that during economic downturns, the government should spend money on projects to inject money into the economy. They are less worried about government deficit spending than about keeping the economy prosperous. Reagan and Bush, in contrast, after the Keynesian school became a little bit discredited, or the laissez-faire approach was kind of discredited during the Great Depression, which was the government should just keep its hands off, should have a hands-off approach. That school of thought was kind of discredited, and like a Keynesian approach or a proto-Keynesian approach became more popular. The Keynesian approach was eventually discredited a little bit in the period of stagflation. We'll talk about stagflation in this fictional AP macroeconomics course, but it's this idea of both high unemployment and rampant inflation, and the idea of like spending more money in the economy just wasn't working to fix it. Reagan and Bush theorized that, or not Reagan and Bush theorized this, but they adopted from Chicago economists, University of Chicago economists, often seen as kind of like these laissez-faire economists. You should think of like the supply side school as kind of, in keeping with laissez-faire thinking. That part of the issue with inflation during the 70s was that there was too many dollars chasing too few goods. So you wanted to impact the supply. And the way that you can do that is that you can cut taxes and spending on domestic programs to stimulate greater production in the private sector. And so there's kind of like a revitalization of like this laissez-faire approach to the economy of shrinking the size of government and cutting spending or cutting taxes. So Keynesian, spend more money, especially in economic downturns. Laissez-faire, reduce the role of government in the economy. You kind of want to spend less. Maybe emphasis on the supply side, emphasis on tax cuts, all that good stuff. We talked about the tragedy of the commons, so like kind of theorizing about the importance of governments in our society. I'm going to include the TED EDU video of the tragedy of the commons to think about we've talked about the importance of government in our society from this when we talked about Thomas Hobbes and thinking about the importance of having a entity that could end a fictional state of nature, where an anarchical state of nature, right? We really want to forego some of our rights and to have kind of a government that could, take up that could provide protection, and so we can avoid a world of self-help. But we also wanted to theorize a bit, especially in preparation for AP Microeconomics next year, the importance of government in an economy itself. And governments can solve quote unquote market failures. Those are instances where people pursue rational actions, but those individual rational choices may be rational for one, but the combination of those rational choices actually produces horrible outcomes for everyone else, right? So it helps us think about the importance of government in regulating certain aspects of our society. So one common market failure that economists talk about a lot is climate change. So individual rational action of fossil fuel companies, of Mr. Diaz wanting to drive to, I don't know, Austin to go visit some family. Those emissions of fossil fuels in aggregate, are accelerating climate change, which could be potentially deleterious or devastating on the United States and other countries. And so the government, in theory, exists in a market economy to regulate and rectify these types of outcomes, these types of tragedy of the common scenarios. Then we talked about political opinion and measuring political opinion. We talked about types of polls, entrance polls, tracking polls. Go ahead and take a look at this. You need to know these types of polls. Exit polls. We talked about the importance of ensuring polling accuracy. I'm going to include in the description the videos that we watch from the Pew Research Center. But generally, we wanted to, the larger the sample, the more accurate the poll was. This is kind of off from directly AP statistics. We talked about the importance of a random sample and a representative sample, and sort of techniques to mitigate polling inaccuracy. And then we actually looked at the polling data of the 2020 presidential election. We looked at some exit ticket polls from the New York Times. Obviously, these are not 100% accurate yet. Polling becomes more accurate after the event. But it was interesting for judging kind of the values that a lot of Trump voters had going into the polls and the values and beliefs that a lot of Biden voters had going into the polls. That's your review video.